Welcome to the 6th Annual Parent Network Workshop. We are pleased to have you join us for, Cans in Idaho, a parent's guide to understanding this powerful tool. And this is part 1. We will do part 2 next hour. Before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping items. If you have questions during the session, you can either put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will monitor that and make sure we get your questions answered. In the coming days, we're going to be posting recordings of this session on our website. So look back at idahoparentnetwork.org and please share it with your friends and families and providers if you think that they can benefit from it. With that out of the way, I want to go ahead and introduce our presenters today. We have Trisha Ellinger, who is having some technical difficulties, is the name of this year, and so she may be joining us a bit later. We also have Dr. April Fernando, and she is a clinical psychologist. She is with Pre-Ed, who is responsible for the CANS, but is also with the University of Kentucky. Amy Marie and myself are both parents, and we are excited today to have the opportunity to chat with Dr. Fernando about all things CANS. And today, specifically in this first session, we are going to be talking about the hats that the CANS wears, how a CANS is different from a CDA and other assessments, and what does a CANS assessment look like, and what should your experience be? So with that, go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Fernando.
All right, thanks so much, Laura. It's nice to be with you all this morning. Again, my name's April Fernando, and just so you know more fully who I am a clinical psychologist. I practiced for over 20 years. I now work with the Pre-Ed Foundation and for the University of Kentucky, and I help states like Idaho implement the CANS. My most favorite part of that work is actually working with providers and working with youth and working with families who are trying to understand how to make the best use of this tool and how to make it work for them. So me being here today sort of makes sense. So I hope that I can impart some of my thoughts and hopefully help you all on your journey with the CANS. So what is the CANS? You probably have been reading the slide as I've been talking. So as it says on the slide, the CANS supports decision making. It helps with outcomes management. It is a tool that's designed to organize information so that it tells the most accurate story of what's going on with your child and what's going on with your family. As you tell your story, the CANS is used to identify needs and strengths. These are themes of what's going on in your lives. And so as the professionals understand these themes in your story, we're better able to provide you with ways to get some support, right? And help you change the trajectory of your kids' lives and your own family's lives. Just for some information, the CANS is used all over the world, but most predominantly in North America, where it was developed. We estimate that approximately 80% of all children who receive care through U.S. public systems have had at least one CANS. So there's a lot of people using the CANS and a lot of children and families who have CANS information at their fingertips. All right, so the hats that CANS wears. Why do I keep hearing about the CANS? So let's talk about what the big deal is about the CANS. And we're going to drill down into the CANS for a minute to better understand what it is and how you can ensure that it's useful to you and your child. So we're going to talk about these multiple jobs that the CANS does. And there are 5 listed here. There's probably more, but these 5 are probably the most relevant to all of you right now. And as I talk about these, I do want our panel of parents to think about examples of how the CANS did this job successfully for them, okay? Identifying functional impairment is actually a buzzword that comes from the billing side of our field. We have to identify functional impairment in order to bill insurance companies. Okay, functional impairment is one of those things that they pay for. So the CANS does identify functional impairments. What does that mean? It means that the CANS identifies where you and your young person need help. And if those areas impact functioning, then we have identified functional impairment. So if you're thinking about the action levels on the CANS, those are the 2s, where you need support, or 3s, where you need immediate or intensive support. Those help us identify where functional impairment lives.
And in Idaho, because Youth Empowerment Services came from the Jeff D. lawsuit, and one of the things in the settlement agreement is that it was a class action lawsuit, and you are a class member if you have a mental health diagnosis and a functional impairment as determined by the CANS. So if you are going through the independent assessor to determine if you are eligible for Youth Empowerment Services or yes, then that is one of the things that they are looking for as an eligibility criteria. Just to throw that out there, that's one of the reasons we do the CANS with the independent assessor.
Cool. Thank you, Laura. All right. Supporting decision making. What does that mean? So hopefully you've experienced a CANS in such a way that you realize what happens is your needs and your strengths get identified. And the way it's identified is through talking about where do you need support and how much support do you need, right? So the CANS does three things. In each of those items, we have to identify, is this actually something that's a need or a strength, number one. Number two, we have to identify, is this need impacting your child's functioning or your functioning as a parent, right? And if it is impacting your functioning, how urgently do we need to provide you support? Okay. Once we identify those things, we have information now that helps us make decisions. It helps us prioritize where you need help. And so the rating of the CANS helps us in making those decisions, identifying where we need to provide support and how urgently we need to provide support.
And I think it's interesting because we change over time. We're not the same human we were, even a week ago. And if something big has happened, it can change quickly. I think that one of the interesting things that we learned using the CANS was to track how things changed. And so we had a CANS done, and we had, I think, that 7 3s on the individual items on the CANS. And for those people who haven't ever done a CANS or looked at the scoring, there's over 100, I believe, in Idaho topics that are addressed on the CANS, and each one of them receives a score 0, 1, 2, or 3. 0, I tell parents, is no evidence that there's a problem. It doesn't mean there isn't a problem. It just, we don't have any evidence right now. And 3 is, there is a fire on my head, please fix it. That is how I tell families that range goes. 2 is, let's get some intervention. 1 is, let's cautiously watch and wait and see what we need to do. But when my son started with 7 items that hit a 3, and then within a couple months, we had over 20 items that hit a 3. Not only did it help us make a decision that we need to move now, like this is going down fast, but as a parent, it told me I wasn't imagining this. This is actually happening. Like, it's not that I am more tired as a mom or more overwhelmed, or, it's the season for crazy in my house. It's not that. There is something changing that we need to address. So when it came to decision making with my son, it told us quite a bit about how fast we needed to move and how intense those services needed to be. And it kind of took the responsibility of begging and trying to convince people, look, this is happening, away from me, because there was this lovely document with a number. And, systems like numbers. If it's in a number class, they're like, oh, I know what to do with that. We categorized it with a number. But categorizing it with help me is not as effective for a system. So when it came to decision making, I was really grateful that happy little number behind me that I wasn't making stuff up.
Right. That's really a great point, Laura. And the number is actually not just because systems like numbers. They do because they're easy to,
It's easy to put a
add
number in a
together.
spreadsheet.
It's easy to
Well, it's
understand.
easier to collect data
It's
and to
easier,
drive
right?
system change.
Exactly. But the other thing that you said, which is equally important, is that it communicates something that everybody understands, right? The system understands the number. Other providers should understand the number. It gives us something where everybody understands and there's hopefully no question about what is being understood because it's communicating. So that's an important part of the CANS. It's a communication tool. Okay. Amy, did you want to say something else?
I was just going to say that, one of the challenges is when you do have several threes, it's then now, okay, which ones do we address first? What are the most urgent to
Right.
address? And sometimes it'll change depending on what's going on with your
Right.
family.
Exactly. Exactly. And to jump to number 5, it informs treatment planning, right? This is why you want to have professionals on your team because, when I heard Laura said, my son had 23s, in my head, I thought, I bet those 23s clump into 3 groups, right? Just from my experience working with kids, 3 or 4 groups. And if we can help you understand how those things clump together, stick together, then it's not 20, right? It's 4 things we need to work on. Not so overwhelming. And that's part of the treatment planning process is not everything is on fire. Some things are smoldering, some things are on fire, and we need to figure out how to group them together.
Right. And I think when we talk about 3, documenting the family story, so many families have been denied treatment or denied services or flat out just not believed because our stories are big. I mean, I have met very few families who are like, yeah, my kid had a day and it was a thing and then we moved on. I mean, that's not the stories we hear. What we hear is we're sitting in the office because we don't know how to help our kiddo. And we're trying to explain the family dynamic or the situation that happened. And they just kind of look at us like, or worse yet, I've had 5 different providers in the last 6 months because they keep, rotating or changing. And I've had to tell this story every single time. And having my kid listen to me talk about their worst days over and over again is horrible. But one thing we found was interesting is my son had a pretty intense bullying incident happen in his past. I mean, it was big and hairy and scary, and it was all the things that hit the news bad. And it had happened a while in the past. And so, is it impacting him right now? And some days the answer is no. He's doing okay. It's not really in this forefront. But something happened. And in our case, someone said a phrase that had been used by his bullies. And all of a sudden we are right back there. And having that story documented so that the provider is doing a kind of a check-in. Hey, how are things going on this? And so when it did get triggered, we didn't have to spend 2 or 3 sessions going back into the story to talk about the nastiness that had happened. We could just say like all of it, it's back. And now it's a 3, like it's a fire. This is a big, 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 big thing. And the speed at which we could respond actually was much faster. And I had never really appreciated that telling my story would allow a quicker response later because I thought we were done. I had blinders on. I thought we had checked that treatment box and we were moving on.
Yeah. You didn't know how powerful trauma is.
You know what? Trauma is like that bad house guest that just shows up when you haven't scrubbed your toilets. That's how it feels. It's always awkward and always unfortunate. So,
something you said around documenting the family story that I want you all to hear is, yes, it's really powerful for what Laura just shared. But the other thing too is that it should be a documentation of the family story that all your providers share. And this is where we, as providers, sometimes are trained in a way that's not helpful to you. Okay? We are sometimes trained that we need to do our own assessment. And unless we do our own assessment, we shouldn't trust it. It's not good. Okay? So what that means, our assessments are really trying to understand your family story. That's really all it is, right? We have to do it in a particular way because the people who pay us need to see certain things, right? So when your providers are insistent on doing their own documentation, the CANS reminds them, hey, you don't have to do that. And by the way, that's not very trauma informed of you, because every time I don't have to tell you this, every time we tell our stories as parents when our children are suffering, it's like what Laura said, it hurts all over again. It hurts you, it hurts your young person. And so the more that we as professionals can prevent that from happening, the better it is. And the CANS is supposed to help make that documentation between providers from meeting to meeting easier.
And I would also like to add that, that also includes the reviews on the CANs. Having a provider that's already working with your family that can update it, while they're meeting with you or between, within conversations that you have with them, not having a complete stranger from the company call and say, hey, it's time to update your CANs. Be like, no, I need to do this with my provider. And that's happened to me several times. And you feel very vulnerable talking about things with somebody who doesn't have a context with your family, especially the big hairy stuff that involves multi-systems. You don't just want to share that lightly. So, right. And not only is it traumatizing to the child, me as a parent can be very triggering and put me in a very uncomfortable situation and put my guard up based upon things that have happened to us in the past.
So when not having to do with the CANs, but the amazing IEP team meetings, that we have all had the opportunity to sit in over our lifetimes. I remember that we went through a period of time where the school kept changing their staff. And so every time we walked into an IEP meeting, at least half of the team was new than from the last time we'd had a meeting. And my son didn't have just an annual meeting. We met multiple times a year, and I still was having new staff multiple times a year. And I finally called the district office and I said, look, some of these people didn't quit. They just are assigned different things right now. And I said, this is what it does. I said, I need you to understand that every time I have to sit in a room of people and tell them how my kid is broken, because let's be honest, you get services for things that aren't going well, not services for things that are going right. And I said, every time I am asked to repeat everything that is wrong with my child, a little part of my soul dies, because my job as a parent is to tell you how fabulous he is to tell you his strengths. It's to tell you, that he's really great with spatial skills and that he has a weird, funny sense of humor and loves puns. It's my job to tell you that he giggles when he touches dogs because he thinks the sensory of the fur just makes he jumps. He's not sure how to handle it. He wants to pet the dog, but he's not sure that the dog wants to be petted, and he giggles. It's my job to tell you that he loves to hang out with his aunt and pretend to go camping in the backyard. That's what I should be telling you. But instead, I'm telling you everything I can think of that will help you understand why you need to help him. But when I have to start over, it kills a little part of my mom heart. And she got really quiet and she said, I took notes and I'm going to go tell the district leadership team. That might be the most profound thing I have ever heard. And I was like, well, I wasn't trying to be profound. I was trying to be mad, but okay. And my IEP team had substantially less turnover after that, because I think the district knew that I was coming for them if they did. But I think when we sit in a therapist's office, especially when we have multiple therapy, teams working together on this, having to point out that my kid was, thrown down a staircase by kids at school in front of him every time, then I get to take that kid home who's just had a trauma trigger And it hurts me that I couldn't stop it. I didn't know what happened. It happened at school. I mean, like, I go through it, he goes through it, our family then goes through it. And the provider's like, well, it was important information. And what I want to say is read your own documentation.
Right.
Like, smack.
Right. Right. Coordinating care is something that has to be a priority. And, I used to run a clinic and always figured out how to find ways to have my clinicians spend more time coordinating care because it paid off in the long run, right? It paid off to help families like yours not have to retell your story over and over again. Let's go to number 4, starting a conversation. So I'm going to talk about an aspect of the way the CANS starts a conversation that maybe isn't the first way you think about the CANS, right? Most people think the CANS, if you look at it, right, looks like a checklist. And there's no other way to sort of put the CANS in a document to organize information other than the way that it's structured and it looks like a checklist. However, right, that's not the way you're supposed to use it. So when I think of the CANS starting a conversation is when we're talking about things where we have different perspectives, right? Laura might have a perspective on what's going on with her son and have one idea, and her son probably has a completely different idea about what's going on with him. That is what the CANS does well. It starts to allow for those different perspectives to surface so that we can really understand what the impact is of what is going on. It impacts Laura in one way, it impacts her son in a different way. Both those things are important for us to consider when we're trying to understand, is this a place where support could be helpful, and what level, what intensity of support do they need? Without those perspectives, we're just writing a plan that is a generic, right? It doesn't matter. But we need to know what's happening specifically for Laura and her son so that the plan makes sense, they can engage in it, and things can change.
I found that a good therapist will ask questions that help me and my son think about whatever it was in a different way. And that conversation required them understanding that we weren't on the same page, or if we were on the same page, maybe we weren't seeing a bigger picture. And I have probably received, I can't speak for my son, but for me personally, I have received more help from the questions that are asked that force me to address it or view it slightly differently. And I mean, when I look at Amy, Amy has more kids than I do. And that means that conversation is substantially more complex than mine. I don't know how she does it actually, but
My cans are 3 hours long.
because I just know that that having a conversation about what's really going on. We have a family joke that my aunt had a big scary thing happen. She was diagnosed with diabetes, and she called her mom to tell her. And my grandmother, adorable human, halfway through said, "So, okay, well, that's nice. What are you doing for Easter?" And it was like, full stop. So in our family, the joke became, when you didn't know what else to say, someone would say, "So what are you doing for Easter?" And that's kind of how our story feels when you tell someone who doesn't get it. Like, "Oh, well, big trauma. That's unfortunate. What are you doing for Easter?" And having that conversation in a CANS framework allows everyone to be on the same table, so are the same place in the same conversation. So I have felt like I had fewer random topic changes from our therapists once they had that bigger picture. And I felt like as we moved through it, we were able to stay focused on the things that we identified were the big hairy stuff, as opposed to, "Oh my goodness, so do you like to paint? Like, where did that come from?" Like, we're talking about trauma. I mean, tie it in, buddy. And that conversation has become more meaningful for our family. I don't know, Amy, do you have a lot of "what are you doing for Easter" comments anymore, or?
No, I mean, I think we've had several CANs. And so my experiences have gone from, being the way that it should be as a conversation to, here are the numbers 0, 1, 2, or 3. Tell me what you think, and go down the list. And I'm like, that is not how it's supposed to go. So, I mean, we have 8 kids, and 1, 2, 3, only 4 of them have had cans, but they've had them multiple times. So, I mean, you can do the math. There's definitely been a variety of experiences. So,
Yeah, I'll talk about the 0, 1, 2, 3s when we get to that portion of our talk together. So to keep you guys engaged. All right. Do you all have any more comments about informing treatment planning? I think I talked about it earlier.
Well, I think it's just important to know that for families who see the cans and treatment plans as 2 separate situations, that the cans is really supposed to be figuring out the things that are going into the treatment plan.
That's
Like, this
right.
is where we're going to focus. And it allows the group, if like, as my son had over 23s, it allows them to break it, the treatment team to say, okay, so what are our groups? What are our things? And is one triggering the other? If what's the thing that we need to work on first? Or what thing do you need as a family to have relief from first, so that
Right.
you're all functional?
yep.
And sometimes I have felt that we had to look at what did we all need to be the
Mhm.
first thing, even if it wasn't his first choice. Like,
Right.
we have to de-escalate this thing
Right.
so that the rest of us aren't sitting in someone else's office doing a cans for
Right.
ourselves.
Exactly.
And
Sometimes it's all, we all need to be able to sleep 2 hours a night. Right. And so that's especially when you have little ones, right? If you don't sleep, no one does well. So sometimes you're right. You have to prioritize what everybody needs so you can really start the hard work of addressing those really focal things.
so I think we can move on, because I think we're going to hit most of this as we come in later with more details.
Sure.
So here we go.
All right. So how is a CANS different from a CDA or other assessments, right? And I'm sure you all feel like you're assessed more often than you're treated. So let's look at the CANS and how it fits within the assessment process. In particular, we're going to look at the CANS and the comprehensive diagnostic assessment. So it's not uncommon for the CANS to be part of the assessment process. What's more uncommon is for the CANS to be the assessment process. So since Idaho has the comprehensive diagnostic assessment, which by the way in other states is called the initial assessment summary or the psychosocial assessment or whatever it's called, it exists in all other states because this type of assessment, the CDA type of assessment, existed before the CANS. It's existed since we've had medicine, doctors. This is what they do in medicine as well, is they try to understand who you are to come to a diagnosis, and that diagnosis helps determine the course of your care. That's true in medicine, in dentistry, that's true in education, that's true in mental health as well. So part of the goal of the CDA is in the word diagnosis, okay? The CANS is not a diagnostic tool. In other words, it's not the tool you use in and of itself to get to a diagnosis. But what's cool about the CANS is that it tells us how is the diagnosis playing out in somebody's life. How can we see the diagnosis in their behavior, in their emotional behavior, in their functioning with their friends and their family, in their risk behaviors, and in their, whether or not they're accessing their strengths? How's it playing out in their relationships with people, right? That's the cool thing about the CANS. So there is a way to use both of the information together, okay? And so it's really important to remember both are ways to organize information, okay? The CANS, however, has an explicit expectation that the youth, the young person, and you, the parent, your perspectives are integrated into that process. That's explicit in the CANS. It's not as explicit in an assessment like the CDA, although Many practitioners believe that's true, and so they try to do it. But in the cans, it's part of how the tool was developed. It's part of doing the tool correctly, is you have to integrate the perspective of young people when they can, and families. All right.
I think one of the things that's hard is that when we go to a provider's office, I think most parents, most people, they show up at a therapist with the assumption they will get therapy.
Mm.
and when you walk in and they're like, we're assessing today. Oh, we're assessing again today. Oh, well, we're not done with the assessments. And you're thinking, why am I here? And so I do have to say that when I'm working on the cans, there is something therapeutic about telling your story. There is something therapeutic about having someone go, oh, that's hard. Wow. Okay. Wow. Oh, there's some feedback there. And with the CDA, I have always felt more like it's an inventory of what's wrong with you so that we can come up with some goals to put on a document so that the insurance will pay for treatment when we get to it, when we're done with the assessment.
Right.
And so I have kind of always felt a little bit of difference. And I know providers in general wish they were the same document or at least attached, like these are the parts that overlap. So let's do those once. And then let's tack on the things that the CDA has that the CANS doesn't. Idaho is not there yet. I know it's been a conversation for years.
Yeah.
But I think how we choose to see it as families can make it the process maybe a little less painful.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking to, Laura, and I'm actually going to talk about, we have a section later called, what's your assessment feel like, or something like that, where I'm going to talk about what I think your assessment should feel like. So I'm not going to talk about that now. Okay. What I am going to say is what you're reflecting, Laura, is the fact that the CDA is driven by the document that clinicians are filling out. That's why it feels inventory-like, because the conversation you're having is not being driven by you and what's going on with you. It's driven by the boxes on the document and going down the document to make sure they fill out the document.
Something that I like to do, because I do know we've had a lot of assessments, and I do know that it takes longer than usually a one setting. If they're only scheduling me for 45 minutes for a CANS assessment, I get to tell them it takes much longer than that. Oh, no, I've done this for years. I'm like, no, my family and my child is more, we're more complicated than that. There's too much to discuss. We can't fit in 45-minute sessions. And I would rather knock it out than have multiple assessments, or it feels like multiple sessions of assessments, especially for the child. They don't want to sit through that either. So, and I mean, that's the thing that I like about the CANS is, you can have the child be there for a portion of it, and then they can leave if they so choose. And sometimes the child wants to stay and be a part of it, and which is great, but then, it can be pretty long.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things about using the CANS versus using something like the CDA is the CDA sort of comes from this idea that it's an expert tool, right? An expert fills it out, asks you questions, you do a brain dump, and they sort of take all that information and fill out their expert tool. I don't know if they share the CDA with you. They should, because it's your info, but oftentimes they don't, right? They'll keep it to themselves. So you don't know how it is that they got from all those questions to the diagnosis. Okay? Whereas the CANS, because it has that expectation of engagement, talking through difficult things so that we can come to a common understanding of what's happening, getting on the same page, right? That engagement part, number one, makes you feel like you've told a story that makes sense. And number two, that transparency starts to help you believe that, hey, something good can come of this because I felt heard. I felt like someone understood what was going on.
Well, and the treatment goals that are required on the CDA feel very high level because they have, I mean, at the base, it's an insurance billing tool.
Yeah.
So they need to cover things that allow them to be flexible in their treatment. So sometimes those goals feel like they're 10,000 feet up.
Yeah.
Treat anxiety,
Yes.
or, you know, handle, handle sense of self-worth, or, like
they're just not personalized. And there's times where, because I do request copies of all of my children's documentation, it's a cut and paste thing. There's times where I have seen another person's information on my child's document because they're so used to making it generalized, and that's just not okay.
Yeah, it's not
So,
okay.
and you won't know that unless you request the records. And then if you do see discrepancies, it's your right, and you can ask them to update it and fix it.
Right.
on the CDA. I really value that there's a diagnosis that's put there. Like, all right, I got a name so I can understand what we're working towards. But the rest of the document, for a large part, I assume, is just the reporting requirements for insurance so that everyone can get paid.
Yeah.
And that's how I have made peace with the CDA. I don't know. I'm sure many providers just bang their heads on the wall that I said that. But for me, I think the cans just feel so much more personal that I have allowed myself to know it's going to get caught there when we're dealing with my kids.
And if any professionals listen to this, any clinicians listen to this, what I have to say is this: the CDA and the CANS overlap so much that when you rate something a 2 or 3 on the CANS, the narrative sections of your CDA should explain why you rated it that way, right? That's how integrated they can be. The narrative can explain why you identified something as actionable and needs support. When they're disconnected, you can also see it. As a supervisor, I used to look at those things and go, you rated this, but you didn't write about it. Like, what does that mean? Or you wrote something that sounded so intense and I looked at the CANS and it wasn't rated very high. Right? So you can use it as a way to make sure that people's stories remain intact when we put them into our documentation.
And I think the other thing that's important is that we don't necessarily need to have today we're doing a CDA meeting and today we're doing a CANS meeting.
Absolutely.
Because so much of this information overlaps. What's
same.
happening in the back of, with the paperwork doesn't necessarily require the family to be sitting there going,
Right.
And so when possible, I think I don't know, Amy, but I appreciate when that information is collected and used in both places without having to be separate events.
I don't think I've seen that happen yet, but I think it would be great.
Let me translate. Same kids, same families, same story.
Right.
Don't understand why we cannot collect the information from them at one time and organize it in our documentation. That's our problem, the documentation organization, not the family's problem. We should not have them go through this multiple times.
Well, it goes back to that saying, one child, one CANS.
Right.
And then one plan. we're trying to add one
child,
plan.
Yeah.
Well, that's why you have one child, one CANS, is to have plans that fit together, not plans that fight each other, and then you don't know what to do, right?
Right. Coordinated planning is like, and coordinating assessments. I mean, I just feel like if I could just run around and throw flowers as I hop down the street and spoke to the people, that would be my thing. Like, let's bring it back together. Let's not pull in opposite directions, because that's how it feels.
Right. Let me spend just a little bit of time talking about the level of care determination, okay, and how that works. So in case you didn't know, the CANS is completed and a level of care is determined, right? And it's based on the CANS item. So it's really important that that CANS reflect the story of that young person. So one of the things that we determine first is, from the CANS items, is there a need for treatment or is there functional impairment? Okay, without that, nobody will need a level of care. So that's the first thing we determine in the model. The second thing we then determine is the complexity of the needs, the complexity of the risk behaviors, the complexity of the supports that parents or caregivers need, those all factor into the different levels. More complex, higher the level. Okay? The intensity of care is driven by complexity. It's not driven by severity. And that's hard to understand sometimes. So I often get questions from clinicians. So-and-so got a 3 on this and they didn't get into level 3. And I said, well, let's talk about the whole kid. And it's like, well, here's why, right? They actually have parents that offset that, that need that young person has. So if the parents need more support, then that's what we should do and not put them in a higher level, right? Let's keep them in a place where they can really be the least restrictive as possible.
I think that is a good thing to describe what exactly is a level of care. Because I know when we in IEP worlds, we have level least restrictive environment.
Right, that's
that,
exactly what I was thinking.
Right. But when we're talking about mental health care, what is a level of care? Is it the type of facility you're in? Is it the amount of hours you spend? Is it how much the person's yelling in your face? I mean, like what's the level of care?
It's an intensity of services that are provided, right? So you have outpatient level, and then you have different levels of care coordination. That's what YES is, right? Mm-hmm. And so the higher level, the more care coordination happens, more case coordination happens, more support is given. I also like to say this out loud: the more people are in your business and in your house, right? So, and I say that because I don't believe putting kids in the highest level of care is always like more is better. No, I don't want people in my house if they don't need to be in my house, right? Like I can do stuff for myself. I want parents to feel empowered, not deflated because people are in their business doing stuff that they could very well do themselves. So you don't want to put a kid with a cold in the ICU. Why? Because they're going to get sicker. You don't want to put kids in higher levels of care if they don't need it. Now, sometimes we don't do a good job of supporting parents. And so we need to find ways to better support them because ultimately you want your kids home with you, right? And you don't want people in your house. So that's what the level of care is supposed to do. The other thing I want to remind you all is this level of care output from the CANs is a recommendation, not an expert decision. So what's supposed to happen is that recommendation gets discussed and you're part of that discussion. And if there are other things that need to be factored in, they get factored in and then a decision is made.
So in other words, it's supposed to actually apply to our family. Shock.
Yes. And if the level of care recommendation is not followed, there has to be a description as to why not, so that the system can make sure that the models are working, and that if there are gaps in services, they can track that.
So for example, if my child needed a day treatment program, which means being there every day, but there just isn't one, then that needs to be documented. So the system goes, oh, we've got people in this part of the state that can't access this level of care because we don't have it, or right. There isn't enough of it.
Right. Or if the level of care was, it went from intensive case management in the community to like a psychiatric residential treatment, and there's nothing in between, right? And so let's say your son rated for that highest level, but it's not appropriate. You can say, hey, that's not good for him. So we're going to keep him at the lower level, but we need all these extra services in order to keep him safe, keep our family functioning at this lower level. We're not putting him up here because that's not good for him.
Which may mean bringing staff into our home to help us manage the needs.
Absolutely.
Right. And I'm going to be honest, the first time I had, staff come into my house, I was like, do I clean the bathrooms? Do I like tidy up? I felt like having a house guest. Mm-hmm. And over time, it was like, yeah, well, we've got people swinging from the chandeliers today. It is what it is. But it took a period of time to get used to that person showing up at my house and knocking on my door and really seeing everything that was happening. And I think at the end of the day, the only saving grace for that was when stuff did hit the fan at our house. I had people who'd been in my home who also contributed to our story and said, this is actually happening, because I think it was hard to believe our story was true.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we look oh so cute and put together when we leave the house, but then
Mm-hmm.
you know, we go home and we have monkeys swinging from the chandeliers and having someone else. So I think there are pros and cons,
Absolutely.
but I do remember that day that I was so grateful that I wasn't losing my mind. This really was happening. Other people could see it. Amy, you have more people in your house than I ever did in mine, but
Yeah. Well, and that's something that I remind people, and I'm very open about, you know, if you have a concern, feel free, please contact me. If you would like to talk with the multiple providers in and out of my home on a daily basis, please do. You know, don't just assume the worst and pull the trigger when you don't know what's going on. And because that causes more trauma in my home. So yeah, and luckily, I mean, it's not as many. I mean, our kids have started, you know, once they got the supports that they needed and they started to level out, we've been able to decrease the amount of supports that we have. And so now we are actually only down to one child that is in services, but that one child has multiple services. And so there's still multiple people that are in our home. So
Yeah.
I mean, there was one time I remember there was a season in life where 3 kids had CBRS workers in the house at the same time, and then they could actually work together with their own provider and work together at getting along with their siblings and have somebody else be the referee instead of mom.
Yeah.
we actually had lose a board game as a goal for a while. Like
Mm-hmm. I
we
can
would play
imagine that.
games with we would play, and then it was also and lose and win, because
Yes.
both required different sets of skills. But I
Right.
remember the first time I was upstairs not being in the middle of the board game, and I was doing dishes, and I was really excited to do dishes because I wasn't having to listen for the crisis, because this worker in my house was in the middle of the board game and not me. And I thought,
Yep.
is it bad to like click my heels and jump up and celebrate because I get to do dishes all by myself? And and that's when I knew that I had needed more support than I had known up until that moment. That was my
Yeah.
moment of clarity, that I was enjoying dishes by myself.
Yeah. Yeah. So the point of the level of care is determination, is to give you the support you need, right? And sometimes the model is right on target. Sometimes it doesn't consider everything, right? Because it's only based on the cans. So you need to add to it. You need to use it as a way to think through. That's why we call them decision support models, because they support decisions. They don't make them, they support them. So that, you know, when you need to have folks support you in the home, you can. When you don't have to, right? It's just to help you understand, do I really need this or do I not?
And right now it would be weird in our family. It would be very uncomfortable and not
Yeah.
helpful.
Not
So,
helpful. Right.
all right, let's move
Okay.
on to the next topic.
All right. What does a CANS assessment look like, and what should your experience be? So let me take a moment just to talk a little bit about me and my perspective on this. So I was trained that your assessment experience should leave people with more understanding about themselves than before they walked into the room and sat down with me. And that is what I try to do as a psychologist when people come into an assessment with me, however long or short it is that to give them that experience of not only am I learning about them, but they're able to have a moment to sit and reflect about what's going on with them, right? So what are the goals of an assessment is to learn about each other, right? We have to be able to trust each other to work together. We need to understand who is this young person and who is their family, and what journey have they been on, and where are they in that journey, and where do they want to get to? And maybe weirdly, we have to share our thinking with each other. right? I'm a person who tries to really be transparent without freaking out families, right? Because I know sometimes I can freak people out, right? So I have to be constantly aware of that. But the transparency is really important, because if I'm really clear about who I am, what I can do, and when I might, I usually say, hey, that part you're talking about is not something I do well, but I have a friend who's also a psychologist who does that really well. So when we get there, we might think about pulling that person in to help, right? I do introduce the cans to people when I do my assessment, what it is, how it works, how would you engage in it, when do you have children there and when you don't, whatever. But most of my clients don't feel that I'm using the cans. They don't feel it when I'm using other tools. Okay? I don't talk about the numbers. I don't talk about the action levels. I talk about you, what's happening with you. How's it impacting you? How's it impacting the family? Is this a place you think you need help? How soon do you think how urgently do we need help on this? I use the action levels concept of the 0, 1, 2, 3 to talk about you. Because the minute we talk about numbers, we're not talking about you. And that's
I
not
would
the
love to
point.
have a cans experience with you, Dr. Fernando.
I have to say assessments are pretty fun, right? Like it makes me anxious because I always wonder, can I really help these people? But it's like, that's why I became a psychologist. I like to get to know people. I like to hear their stories. I like to try to think about what can we do to help make things better. Right?
You're a parent of a mental health kiddo when the most exciting thing you could win in a sweepstakes is a great cans experience.
Some of you know that I have my son is 22. When my son was younger, we realized he had ADD. And I always tell the story. He knows I tell this story, right? Kids with ADD are ignored because they don't have the H. They're not hyperactive.
Right.
Plus, if you have a kid who's cute and has ADD, they really get ignored. Cute kids, there's studies done on good-looking children in education, and they get ignored, right? Because they think they're doing fine. When we understood that he had ADD, we also understood he had dyslexia. We understood all these things about him and how he was struggling. And, I knew several folks that to get him assessed and so that we had a diagnosis so we could get him accommodations. And also get him used to being assessed, because to get accommodations in school, you have to be assessed every 3 years, right? So we had to get him used to that process. And also to, I had some friends who were psychiatrists, and so had him meet with some cool people who really knew how to work with him. But I have to say that when my psychiatrist friends started their assessment process, they forgot who was in the room with them. And so they started in, and I'm like, really, George, this is how we're going to do this assessment? Right? It's like, and they're like, oh, I said, I'm happy to go along, but this won't work for him, right? This won't work for my son. He's going to feel like he's the object of something. So let's try a different route, right? Like, because I knew them, I could do that. But even mental health professionals have to stop a process sometimes if it's not working for them. Okay?
I'm glad. I'm sad that it happened to you, but I'm glad you can relate.
I totally can relate, right? And in fact, my son said his third psychiatrist, because child psychiatrists move a lot, because there's not enough of them in the country. Mm-hmm. So and if they're good, they're moved like across the country to, run programs and stuff. And so the third psychiatrist my son had, he's like, Mom, I can't do it. Can we fill out a cans and give it to them? I said, sure, we can work on a cans, but we're going to have to tell them what it is, and you're still going to have to talk to them, right? You can't just hand them a cans and not talk to them. He's like, okay, that's fine. So that's what we did.
Yay for having a mom in the know. Yay.
So why don't you, Laura and Amy, lead us through these questions? Like, which ones are the most important that you want us to chat about?
Well, I think a couple are low hanging fruit that we can just knock out that don't require a lot of discussion. So why do I need an ROI, release of information? And that's because of the teaming process and the way the CANS is set up in Idaho. You have to be able to fill out some releases of information so that other providers can see the results. Which also leads into, do I get a copy and who else gets a copy? And so the answer is yes, you can have a copy at any time. Smile, nod, said, hand me a copy, and they can print it out. They have that capability. You can either use the ROI to push your CANS results to another provider, and that's a whole system on the back end that providers do, or you can actually hand them a hard copy of your CANS if that's what you want. So that is just some low hanging fruit. But if you do not sign that release of information, or you do not have a hard copy yourself, no one else is going to see it, which makes it much harder to collaborate on the results if no one else has it. So those aren't CANS rules, those are HIPAA compliant rules of how you handle transfer of sensitive data. So just know that that is something that you may need to spearhead because your providers will not know everyone you want to share it with unless you tell them. So how often are they done? This comes down to insurance and need. That's a kind of a cross answer. So the CANS is supposed to be done every 90 to 120 days, depends on who you're talking to. Most people default to 90, or when there is a significant change you need to document. So for example, if my house burned down and my kids were all quite traumatized, or we lost a family pet, or something happened that triggered my kids, then even though we did a CANS last month, we might want to do an update to capture that new information, especially if they were spiraling, because that is important. And let's see, I think those are the easy ones to go through. And I think some of these we have touched on. Is a conversation or a checklist? And the answer is, for purposes of keeping track of your data, the provider sees what could look like a checklist, but it is actually presented as a conversation. And if your provider tries to give you, here's 0, 1, 2, 3, what do you think? It is acceptable to say, that's not how this is done. And if they look at you like you have snakes climbing out of your ears, you can either ask to see another provider or you can gently guide them into a better way of doing things.
Right. If I could jump in just a second, there are some families and there are some young people who would rather go through the checklist.
Sure.
Okay. So just know that, some people don't know how to start a conversation about what's going on or how to share their story. So they might say, hey, can you go down the checklist? And I comply, but I always start to see when they're getting comfortable and then drop the checklist and just have a conversation. But that's me, right?
Well,
so if
in full transparency, we did that. I mean, we were many CANs in, and we'd had multiple updates. And we, I don't know how many, it felt like dozens, but it probably wasn't that many that we had done. And so we had just recently done it, and we were going through an update because we'd had some changes. And I just said, hand it over. And I circled the areas that I knew we had changes in, so we could have conversations there.
Right.
As opposed to going through every part of it. And that made it faster for us.
The other thing that is sometimes different within different kinds of families is, do you hand, as a clinician, do I hand a blank CANS to the family or not? Some families like that, right? They like to know what's coming up, what we're going to ask, what it is. They like to keep track, especially in ongoing meetings, right? When we have a CANS, I used to let my clients fill in the bubbles with different colors so that they could be engaged, right? Like I had a little kid who, little 5-year-old who used little emojis, and the 3 was a little poop emoji. He loved it so much, he gave himself threes all the time. So I had to change it to something he didn't like so much, but he was engaged, right? So sometimes that checklist part of it can be really helpful, especially ongoing. But initially, there are some people who like to see it, like full transparency. So it's good as a provider to ask. And
Well,
if
for
that's
visual
kind of
learners, it's easier to follow along sometimes.
exactly. So if that's how you are, ask. It's okay.
So I think probably the biggest one that we haven't touched on, and I know we're running over time, but we've got the time, so let's answer this question. Are we supposed to agree on the narrative and actionable items before the CANS is finalized? And I think that is one thing that Idaho has struggled with in implementation, is that the provider documents everything they heard you say, and then you have the chance to look at it and go, wait a minute, you said in here that, we have 5 aliens living in our house, but we really only have 2, or, it helps you make sure that you've clarified, because sometimes our stories are hard to follow. I don't know. My story is so simple, no one could miss it. No, not true. Everybody has struggles making sure that they captured it correctly, and that means that you can verify it. There's nothing more frustrating to a family than to get a report and you're like, that's not true.
Yes,
Right.
especially when, we had that with a psych evaluation, and he said, it is finalized when we give it to you. There is no discussion. I do not update it. So I'm like, okay, thank you very much. I won't use you again. You missed some points here.
Well, and the CANS assessment that is done by the independent assessor is done for eligibility for Medicaid services under Youth Empowerment Services. It is the same CANS. However, they're not following you. They are not your everyday provider, so they are not necessarily going to have the background knowledge. Even when they do the update, you may not get the same assessor. So that's the only thing. The CANS itself is the same, but your experience may feel different just because it's not someone you have a relationship with, and they are looking for a functional impairment for eligibility, not for treatment planning.
Right. So if I could just say really quickly, one thing you should know is that most clinicians will work with you on trying to come with consensus around where you need support, right? Unless they feel it's a safety issue.
Mhm.
And their ethics and their legal guidelines are going to supersede all of that. And they're going to say, I hear what you're saying, but I'm worried about this safety issue. Therefore, I'm going to make this something we have to address.
And I've had things that they thought it was less of a big deal than we felt it was, partly because so many things were a big deal that I think they kind of lost how big of a deal we thought that was in the noise of all the deals.
Yeah.
So that was a conversation of, no, this is really more important to our overall picture than we captured it.
Right.
And so that was it. So we do get to continue this conversation next hour, because we knew that there was no way to discuss all the things about CANS in an hour, not even possible. I mean, Amy and I can't even do a CANS in an hour. So, but I wanted to make sure in this one in the corner, we talked about CANS being partially completed without my kiddo. And that is an okay thing. You can talk to your counselor or your therapist, whoever's doing this CANS, and say, hey, there's some parts of this story that we need to talk about without my kiddo there. Part of that is to keep them from re-traumatizing on those story pieces. And part of it is there may be parts of the story that the kid doesn't know all the details to, and it's not appropriate developmentally for them to know all of it, especially the stuff going on with the family that, don't need to add it to them. So, and if your kid has a 10-minute attention span, it may just be you need to give background so that you've got the ability for your kid to be there for the stuff that's really important for them. So I think we've touched on most of these, and I think some of the others we're going to hit in the other sessions, but we're going to leave you for now, and we will be back in about 10 minutes. If you guys are joining us for the next session, make sure you log into the next session, and we will see you. We're excited to continue this conversation. There's so much more to talk about. All right, we will see you guys in just a little bit. Okay, bye guys.